welcome to the first instalment of the next series of videos on paper 2. This is Anglo Saxon and Norman England, and this is looking at key topic 1, which is the pre-conquest between 1060 and 1066. So this key topic is predominantly looking at the Anglo Saxon kingdom, the makeup of society, how the king ruled that society, everyday life, the legal system, the church, but then into looking at the Godwin family, the power of the Earls of Wessex, and how Harold Godwinson becomes king, and how there is a succession crisis leading to the battle at Hastings. Just as a little bit of context, it's worth just noting, Anglo-Saxon England was about 600 years in the making. At the end of the fifth century, beginning of the 5th century, the early 400s, the Romans leave Britain, and a series of Anglo-Saxons, Jutes, migrate from northern Germany and Denmark and settle in what is now England. Very quickly it becomes a series of different kingdoms, Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, East Anglia, Kent, but eventually over time, through Viking invasions, we see England develop. So Angles, Angle land becomes England. Wessex is the most powerful kingdom. It's the one kingdom that holds out against the Viking invasions from the 8th and 9th centuries as well. But by the 10th century, the first recognised King of England, Athelstan, is crowned King of England. So by the time our course starts in circa 1060, the practices of Anglo-Saxon kingship are very much confirmed. And just to kind of talk about that structure, so the king is in charge of the country, they are crowned, but we also have a class below them. So we have the earls, there would have been about 6 of them. So the former kingdoms that I mentioned earlier eventually become earldoms, and these earls owe that to the king at the time. Below them, you've got your kind of local nobility, which is the thanes. There would have been about 4,000 to 5,000 of them. Then you've got your ceorls, who are your freemen. So these were people who would have been able to work on the land for the thanes, but also would have been paid a wage. And then below them, obviously, you've got the peasants then as well. And the peasants were tied to the land and had to give that labour. Something that we'll see very similar in the feudal system under the Normans. And then lastly, about 10%, and that's 70% of the peasantry, 70% of the population was peasants, which meant about 10% were actually slaves. So the Anglo-Saxons did actually have slaves. To talk about national government then first, and then we'll talk about more local government. But these are the 4 kind of most powerful institutions in Anglo-Saxon England. So you have got the king, and the king is technically the most important person in Anglo-Saxon society. The church, obviously, from the medieval medicine course, we know how influential the church are in the Middle Ages. The Witan, so the council, so literally translating to meeting of wise men, and then the earls as well. So obviously the earls play a big role there as well. We've already talked about them. The king has ultimate power. He's God's representative on earth. It's his job to protect the country. It's his job to raise the army. It's his job to raise tax. He's in charge of the production of silver coins, and because he is chosen by God, he has that power, but is also massively aligned with the church as well. So the king had to be crowned by the Archbishop of Canterbury, anointed by holy oil, just similar to what we saw in the recent coronation. And the church were very powerful. They owned about 25% of the land. The king directly owned about 30%. So you can see that the church had a huge influence within Anglo-Saxon society, and we'll talk a little bit more about that soon as well. Whilst everyone owed the king loyalty and their service, in Anglo-Saxon England, the earls also had lots of power and lots of influence. The earldoms, such as Wessex and Mercia, were huge. Northumbria essentially covered the whole north of the country, Mercia the Midlands, Wessex the southwest as well. Agriculture is a huge part of wealth in Anglo-Saxon England, and we know that a lot of the good farmland and the best farmland raw materials were found in the West Country of England in Wessex as well. So earls are really powerful. There's about 6 of them generally. There were more earldoms, but we're talking about the big ones here really. And Wessex, Mercia, and Northumbria are the ones we're most interested in. They would serve on the Witan as well. So this council alongside the church main bishops of the 15 bishops of the diocese, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Archbishop of York, and the king as well. Now, whilst the Witan was very powerful and influential, they obviously would decide and help the king make decisions. They would give their advice. Obviously, weaker kings would be swayed more by the Witan, like Edward the Confessor, especially when you had powerful earls like Earl Godwin, the Godwin family of Wessex, on the council. But ultimately, it was the king's final decision. He chose when it met, and even though when the king died, the Witan would decide its successor, the next king, the king ultimately had the power over the Witan, but they had lots of influence. And that's the key relationship between these 4 is who has power, who has influence. The king has a lot of power, but also the other institutions such as the earls, the Witan, and the church have a lot of influence over the king in that sense as well. Let's talk about then the Godwins. So there's a map of the earldoms of England in 1065. So we can see the size of Northumbria, the size of Mercia, and obviously the size of Wessex as well. East Anglia is another significant earldom, but it's not as powerful. By 1065, Wessex is ultimately it is the most powerful earldom by this stage, and the Godwin family are the rulers of Wessex as well. What we'll talk about in a bit is how essentially they control most of England through the earldoms, through siblings and marriages as well, and which is why Harold Godwinson ended up being so powerful. Just to talk about a more kind of local side of things as well, obviously Anglo Saxon England, as I said, 600 years in the making, and it is very much an established, wealthy and safe and secure country by the 1060s as well. It's what makes England so appealing to foreign invaders such as William, Duke of Normandy, and Harold Hardrada as well. So we kind of we split it really into kind of military, economic, political, and social as well. And the most key individual amongst all this is the Shire Reef as well. So we have the kingdoms ruled by the king, we have the earldoms ruled by earls as well, but then those earldoms are then divided into counties like we have now in England. We don't have earldoms anymore, but we have counties as well. And then you get shires, Yorkshire, for example, Lancashire. So this is where we get these here. And then they're subdivided into hundreds, and hides and whatnot as well. So these are the kind of the way in which the land is structured. But the Shire Reef plays a massive role in the success of local government, and Anglo-Saxon government on a local level is certainly successful. It's one of the reasons why the Domesday Book is so successful, because of the Anglo-Saxon local government, and it's really, really efficient and effective, and William doesn't really change a great deal when he becomes king. But the Shire Reef is really important because they're responsible for raising the fyrd. So this is the army, which obviously, when the king needed an army, there wasn't a standing army, the fyrd would be raised. They were predominantly farmers, obviously, and the wealthier you were, the better armed you were, like the Thanes, for example, or the housecarls, who were the earl's main elite bodyguard. But they could raise a lot of men through this system as well. Each hide had to provide one man for the fyrd. They also had to collect taxes as well. So through the taxation, so whatever the king's tax was. So the geld tax was a particular one that was popular, that was meant to stave off the threat of the Vikings, but any other taxes as well. It was the Shire Reef's job to collect that, to enact justice as well. So they would set up shire courts, and they would listen, obviously, so the peasants would come from far villages to the centre, to the burh, as we call them, the town, and the Shire Reef there would dispense justice as well. And we'll talk a little bit about the Anglo-Saxon legal system as well. And then just to ensure that the laws of the land were actually enforced as well. They had the seal of the king to say they were acting on the king's authority, and we know this is something that William will also use as well through the use of writs as well. So just to talk about the Anglo-Saxon legal system then, it's based on pragmatism, but also superstition, but also trying to find logical solutions to problems as well. The image here shows the infamous trial by ordeal. So this is where we see the church being really influential, where someone was accused of a crime, and if they plunged their hand into boiling water, if they were able to lift it out and pick up an object and be okay, they were innocent. If it burned, they were guilty as well. Obviously, it's always going to be that their hand would burn, therefore meaning they were guilty as well. But just showing you how the church obviously played a role in there as well, but also the issues of blood feuds. So if someone from a family was murdered, the idea in Anglo-Saxon society is you have the right to enact revenge and kill that person as well. But this just led to feuds over time, almost like a kind of Montague Capulet kind of situation in Romeo and Juliet. So instead of that, they would introduce the Weregild, so WER Weregild as well. Where you just pay a fine basically as compensation. So quite advanced for its time in that sense. Obviously, the higher status you were, the higher your compensation would be there as well. Capital punishment, so the death penalty was used, obviously to deter others as well. So hangings were used as well if need be as well. Repeat offenders for stealing were often mutilated, so they might have a hand cut off or a nose cut off as well, just so they could not commit those crimes again, but also as a deterrent too. But then significantly, this idea of collective responsibility. So the hue and cry, for example, in a tithing, so that's a group of 10 people, you were responsible for each other's behaviour, kind of like the neighbourhood watch used to be. You may have seen those stickers around before, neighbourhood watch. You're meant to kind of help the police solve crimes by looking out for each other. But the hue and cry, you were all expected to join in and chase the criminal as well. And if you didn't, you could receive a heavy fine if you didn't do that as well. So again, it's this emphasis that the whole community is meant to keep things safe and secure. We've already talked about the church a little bit as well. I'm not going to go into too much detail about the structure of the church. I think we're quite okay with that. But as we said, the Archbishop of Canterbury is the most important in the church, and the Archbishop of York as well. And they essentially split they divided the kingdom into two, York being in charge of the northern church and the southern church by Canterbury. But ultimately, Canterbury is the most important as well. Below them, you have 15 bishops. They're in charge of a diocese, and then below them, you then have the kind of priests and priors in charge of different areas as well in the church too. As we know, they are the centre of learning, just like when we looked at medicine as well. I think the most important thing to consider is obviously their role in government. We've already talked about that, how they worked on the Witan, and they had a seat on the Witan, and they acted as advisors, and they obviously had to confirm the choice of king through that ceremony of the oil of the coronation as well. But a big issue was that lots of monasteries were in decline, and lots of people believed that the Anglo-Saxon church was actually corrupt. And as we know, when Lanfranc becomes the Archbishop of Canterbury in 1070, that's one thing that he's really going to focus on, is the reform of the church. Towns and villages then. So as we said, Anglo-Saxon England had a population of probably around 2 million approximately, which was a high number during the 11th century. They were major towns such as London and York and Norwich, but lots of villages as well. Many are mentioned in the Domesday Book. Dagenham is one of those. So around 90% of the population lived in villages. So fewer lived in towns and cities, but we obviously see that develop as time goes on as well. And the villages are predominantly focused on a certain type of economy. It's agricultural. So agricultural economy. They would have sheep and cows for pasture. Very rarely would they kill animals. They'd keep them alive. So they were mainly living on a diet of kind of bread, corn, those kind of things, vegetables. They would base their economy on what's called a subsistence economy. They would only just produce enough. They might sell off a little bit of surplus, if they had the time. But mainly people didn't have the time to go to the town to sell it. Life was about surviving in the village as well. Obviously, the church plays a huge role in the village as well. But it's the towns really that we see, different type of economies. This is where we see the market, and we see the exchange economy as well. So whilst there were coins available, obviously we know the royal mint would produce coins. Many people would simply barter goods as well, for things that they wanted in return as well. Wool was a really huge export in England. Sheep's wool in England was considered some of the best in Europe. So many people in Europe imported English wool and then turned that into fine cloth, into clothes as well. But then what the English would do is to import lots of German silver, therefore to make their coins, but also Anglo Saxon jewellery was renowned throughout Europe as well. So lots of you'd find those jewellers, blacksmiths, for example, in towns, or burghs as we call them, these fortified kind of cities as well. So that's the kind of local side of things. So just to talk about then the kind of political side and looking at the significance of the Godwin family. So Earl Godwin gave his support to Edward the Confessor during the 1050s. By the time he dies, and his eldest son Harold becomes the Earl of Wessex, and this is where we really see the influence of someone like Harold take over Edward the Confessor as well. He's married to Edward's sister, so the King, Edward the Confessor, and Harold are brothers-in-law. And what he does over the next few years is he kind of spreads the Godwin web across England as well. So his sister Edith marries Edwin of Mercia. So obviously a really significant earldom in the centre of England. So a key alliance. That's how marriages were used. His younger brother Gurth becomes the Earl of East Anglia, and Leofwine becomes the Earl of a more minor earldom in the southeast as well. But significantly, in 1064, we see Tostig Godwinson become the Earl of Northumbria as well. So he's essentially tied himself to the majority of the kingdom through siblings, nepotism, but also through those kind of political alliances as well. And Harold is an extremely astute earl. He understands the importance of links with the church. He built Waltham Abbey in Essex. He goes on a pilgrimage to Rome, so he shows his dedication to the church as well. But he was also an excellent military commander. He had led a series of military campaigns in Wales on behalf of Edward the Confessor. Many local thanes, admired Harold for his military skill as well, and then obviously the political connections that he had as well. So he was extremely powerful during the 1060s, 1065. Unfortunately, in 1065, though, there is a rebellion, despite all of Harold's good work, against Tostig. He was obviously a southerner, and the northerners didn't really like the southerners at this time as well. So he actually faced a rebellion because he didn't really spend much time in his earldom as well. And also Northumbria had really strong ties to the Vikings. The Vikings had settled in Northumbria. They'd made York their capital, hence why it's called Jorvik, and then we get York. So he faces a really severe and serious rebellion, and the rebels attacked York. They invited Morcar, the brother of Edwin of Mercia, to become the new earl as well, who was, one of them, who was a northerner. Harold was sent to speak to them. So Edward the Confessor knew that Harold was the best person to kind of end this rebellion, and he actually accepted their demands, knowing that Tostig was too weak to rule. And in the end, Harold knew that he had to side with King Edward rather than his brother. So we know that Tostig will come back to cause many problems later on. So in 1065, the first kind of upsetting amongst the Godwin family happens, and Tostig is removed as he goes into exile, and Morcar becomes the new earl at that time as well. Significant in the same year, we get one of the main reasons why William eventually and does invade. 10 years prior, William had claimed that Edward the Confessor had promised him the throne. Um, in 1064-65, we're not exactly sure when, and we're not exactly sure of the circumstances, but we know is that Harold is apparently found in Normandy, whether he goes there on purpose, his embassy to Normandy as it's called, or whether he's shipwrecked, whether you believe the Normans or the English. He, according to the Bayeux Tapestry, as we see here, he swears on holy relics that he would support William's claim. Other stories have emerged that the holy relics were hidden underneath a kind of bit of cloth, and then it's revealed, and Harold feels that he's been tricked. Other stories, obviously the Norman chroniclers, suggest that Harold knew he was swearing on holy relics, and he knew that he was doing that as well. Nonetheless, it's a significant moment. It's going to be a main cause of William invading, because he feels that he's been promised the throne, and he feels that the person who swore on holy relics has gone against God, therefore must be removed. Then we get into that huge rivalry for the throne as well. On the 5th of January 1066, Edward the Confessor dies. He dies without a child, and the succession is left rather unclear. So, William, the Duke of Normandy, had claimed since the 1050s that the throne was his. Edward had spent time in Normandy. His mother was Norman, Emma of Normandy. So from William's point of view, it was a foregone conclusion. Harold claims that on Edward's deathbed, that he wants Harold to be king. Obviously, he's married to Harold's sister. The Godwin family are extremely powerful and influential, and Harold was, for many in England, amongst the earls and the thanes, the natural successor. He was the military commander. He'd helped put down the rebellion against Tostig. He'd helped fight the Welsh. He had all his political connections. It was a no-brainer. Another contender, though, that causes problems is the idea of Edgar Etheling, the only blood nephew and blood relative of Edward the Confessor, but he's 14 years old. He'd spent most of his time in exile in Hungary. He didn't understand English customs. He probably didn't speak the language, to be honest. And at a time where you needed military clout and power and influence and connections, Edgar Etheling just didn't have any other things. And then you have Harold Hardrada, obviously no real direct connection to the throne. The fact that the Vikings had been kings of England in the early 1000s, the early 11th century, but ultimately for Harold Hardrada, it's Tostig, persuading him to invade, but also Hardrada thinking, one last chance. He was 50 years old. He was a great warrior. Why not? We get the event of 1066 then, and Harold's under huge threat in his early days. Suspiciously, he's crowned the very next day. The Witan agree to crown him king, and he's crowned. And for some people it's suspicious, for some people it's not, knowing that what was coming. But ultimately he's crowned King of England on the 6th of January 1066. And then he knows immediately that there's going to be a repercussion of this. And 2 weeks later, when William hears, he apparently flies into a fit of fury and immediately begins planning the invasion of England. So Harold raises the largest army ever seen, probably since the time of the Roman invasion 1,000 years earlier. We think of probably about 7,000 to 8,000. Again, estimates differ, but it's a huge army, and they wait on the south coast, waiting for the imminent Norman invasion. It doesn't come. It will come, but it doesn't come at this stage. From that time, Tostig begins to raid the southeast coast at Sandwich, where the Royal Fleet are held. He raids the Norfolk and Lincolnshire coast, but Harold had been quite smart. He'd gone to the north of England, particularly after Tostig's rebellion. He'd met Edwin, Earl of Mercia, and Morcar, Earl of Northumbria, and he had cemented an alliance with these two really powerful and influential earls in the, obviously, earls of two of the big major earldoms other than Wessex as well. And it's Edwin and Morcar who are able to push Tostig away from the Lincolnshire and Norfolk coast. Tostig will eventually find himself in Scandinavia. By this time, though, it's around September of 1066. The Fyrd are restless. They've been waiting on the south coast for months upon end, really expensive to keep an army standing. The invasion of William doesn't seem to be coming. It's getting later in the year. It's unlikely that William will invade. Armies didn't invade during the winter. It wasn't a smart idea with supplies. So Harold actually disbands the Fyrd and they go home. It's at that time, in late September, that then the Vikings land, and this is, catastrophic news for Harold Godwinson. Harold Hardrada and 240 ships have landed on the east coast in Yorkshire with Tostig Godwinson, and they march on York, which is where Edwin and Morcar are going to meet them. They are going to meet them outside the city walls of York. A really poor decision is to not defend York and to stay on its walls, but actually to meet them outside the city walls at the Fulford Gate, so Gate Fulford, and there is the sign, the plaque to show you where the battle was in 1066. Now, the Viking strategy is a clever one. They had quite similar tactics to the Anglo-Saxons with the shield wall. In fact, the Anglo-Saxons learnt that tactic off the Vikings. And they set themselves up. They had the River Ouse on their flank, but the land behind them was extremely boggy from poor weather as well. And Hardrada purposely puts his Tostig Godwinson on his weaker flank, knowing that the Anglo-Saxons were going to go straight for him as well. Obviously, Tostig was extremely unpopular. That's exactly what they do. And when they do that, Hardrada and the Viking centre then smashes into the Anglo-Saxon line. They're beaten back with ease. It's a massacre. Edwin and Morcar escape with their lives, but thousands of Anglo-Saxon of the Mercian and Northumbrian Fyrd are killed. And Hardrada later boasts that there were so many English dead that they could walk over the bog without getting their boots muddy. The Vikings then will take York, but they agree to exchange hostages. This was quite common, and they go to a place called Rickhall, where they're going to, a few miles away from York, where they're going to recover from the battle, and they're going to meet at Stamford Bridge to exchange hostages in a few days' time. Now, by this stage, Harold Godwinson in the south is going to hear news of the invasion, but it's unlikely that he would have heard that the English were defeated at Gate Fulford. He then obviously has to raise the Fyrd again, but the Anglo-Saxon administrative system means he can do this. He marches north. He probably collected soldiers along the way, and on the way it's likely he would have heard that the Vikings were waiting at Stamford Bridge. So he changes his plans and he heads towards the small village of Stamford Bridge, up in northeast of the city of York, about 8 miles away. The Vikings were not expecting a huge Anglo-Saxon army to arrive. They're expecting a hostage exchange. It's a particularly warm day on the 25th September, and the 28th, sorry, and they don't have any armour on. There's a tiny river, the Derwent, at Stamford Bridge, and a small bridge protecting it as well. So when the Anglo-Saxon force turns up with Harold Godwinson, Hardrada and Tostig are taken completely by surprise, and they're rushing to get into formation across on the bridge as well. Now, a huge Viking is on the bridge, a berserker, as they were called, literally for going berserk, and these were men who would take a head off with their double-handed axe, or even slice a man in two with that much power. And he's killing all the Anglo-Saxons on the bridge. They can't push through. And then the story is an Anglo-Saxon goes underneath the bridge and spears the Viking from underneath as well. The bridge is then available. The Anglo-Saxons then use arrows to fire into the Viking centre. Again, don't have their armour on, and eventually they're pushed back. Hardrada is killed with an arrow through the throat, and the Vikings are then routed. They believe, only 20 or so ships leave the English coast after 240, so we can see the huge amount of casualties of the Vikings. So Hardrada was dead, Tostig Godwinson was also killed, and this huge threat to his kingdom had been eliminated by Harold, and that's when he hears the disastrous news that William and an army of around 7,000 had just landed on the southern coast. The winds had been particularly stormy in the English Channel, so William's arrival had been postponed, but when he does land, he immediately builds a castle. He's assembled a huge invasion force, as I said, of 7,000 men. You know, the amount of horses and supplies, 13 tons of grain and 13 tons of hay, you know, have been brought, 2,000 horses. This is a huge invasion force. So he sits on the south coast, he builds a castle at Pevensey, and he waits for Harold Godwinson to arrive. So when we get to Hastings then, obviously the key decisive factor in Hastings is the troops really, and obviously the impact before the battle as well are massive. William's really well prepared, he's got the backing of the Pope, he's got all the supplies, he's fresh. Harold's just fought the Vikings in the north, his army has been depleted, they have to march south again. He doesn't have the support of Edwin and Morcar because of their defeat at Gate Fulford, so he has to raise what men he can. And obviously he has his housecarls. We talked about the housecarls a bit before. These are the elite soldiers of the Anglo-Saxon army. They would have their huge round shield, they would make the shield wall, and they could hold it for hours. You know, the shield wall is all about endurance and discipline, and the housecarls could do that. The only problem is that a lot of the rest of the Anglo-Saxon army were formed of the feared. You know, these are peasant farmers or ceorls, or the thanes, who are less disciplined, not as well armoured, who are able to keep that shield wall disciplined for as long as well. The Norman cavalry was the elite force of the day. You know, these men would have trained on these huge war horses from a very young age, with their kite shield, and they would be able to obviously charge the enemy with pace. They were mobile, they were agile, and they really are the elite force. Alongside that, William has infantrymen and he has archers as well. Now Harold finds himself on Senlac Hill, and obviously he's going to form a defensive formation. The key for the victory of the battle was to wear the Normans down and get to nightfall. If it got to nightfall, the Normans would have to retreat, and then they are obviously on foreign soil, and the battle would have been lost, and they would have had to retreat. So that's the game plan from Harold. He's in the centre, in the thick of it, in the shield wall, and as we know, they were quite evenly matched in numbers. William attacks the Anglo-Saxon line time and time again, but they're firing up the hill, they're going up the hill, the horses' impact is limited, and the shield wall was able to keep strong. The death toll starts to increase, but as the battle goes on, we see for the first time the use of the feigned retreat. Now again, if the Normans intended this, we don't know, it's been debated, but we know that it happens. And it's the Bretons first on his weaker left flank who break rank, they run down the hill, and the ill-disciplined part of that shield wall follow them down, and the Bretons are able to turn around and take out some of the Anglo-Saxons. So this was a tactic that later on would be used later on. But at this key moment, a rumour had gone around the battlefield that William was dead. Obviously, he showed great leadership, and he pulls his helmet off, he rallies his troops, and what we see during the rest of the battle is we see the continued use of the feigned retreat. Gurth Godwinson is killed, and we start to see more of the housecarls killed as the Norman line keeps on hitting time and time again. As the feigned retreat weakens the shield wall, the archers start to have an impact as well, and it's this point where we believe that Harold Godwinson is shot with an arrow, and he's famously shown on the Bayeux Tapestry with an arrow in his eye. We don't know for sure if that's how he was killed. He may have been run down by a Norman knight, but we know that he is killed. Ultimately, the death of Harold towards the end of the battle, the use of the feigned retreat, and the inability of the shield wall to hold its ground because of the prior events of that battle as well, obviously fighting the Vikings in the north, meant that in the end it was a victory for William. That's the end of the video. Obviously, key topic 1 is the biggest one, so this is probably going to be the longest video. Hopefully that's been helpful, and tune in next for the next video, which is about William's control from 1066 through to 1075.